me introduce you to today's speaker, and we are very happy to welcome Timothy C. Guetterman, and he is an applied research methodologist who specializes on mixed methods research. He is he's an assistant professor and the associate director of the Mixed Methods program at the University of Michigan. His methodological interest lies in mixed methods research, in quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods methodologies, and he also conducts NIH-funded health services research with a particular focus on improving equity and health services using informatics technology. He also co-authored the 6th and 7th editions of the Educational Research Planning, Conducting and Evaluating Quantitative and Qualitative Research with John W. Creswell. Moreover, he also serves as a co-editor-in-chief for the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, and he's also the president of the Mixed Methods International Research Association. So we are very happy to have him here today. And with that, I would also like to hand it over to you. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to first start by just sharing some characteristics of mixed methods research. There are different ways to think about mixed methods, and I'm going to share sort of how I was trained and how I think about mixed methods, and then use that to really get into integration and how you can design the study so that it's well set up and prepared for integration, and then on to how you might conduct some integrative analysis. And then we'll conclude by rounding back to Maxqda and how that can facilitate mixed methods integrative analysis as I hand over to Tamara again. So welcome everyone, starting with the characteristics of mixed methods research. And this is largely from Creswell and Plano-Clark, how they define mixed methods and what it is. So there are 5 key characteristics. First, that we're collecting and analyzing qualitative and quantitative data. So that's really critical, the use of both qualitative and quantitative methods. Next, that we're using rigorous qualitative and quantitative methods. And we'll get into detail about each of these. We're using a mixed methods design, and the design guides our overall procedures for research, the flow of the process. We're integrating the 2 forms of research, and then often using a philosophy or theory as a lens for what we do. So let's dive into each of these areas in just a little bit more detail. Again, just to give us a common framework as we're thinking about integration. So for one, collecting and analyzing quantitative and qualitative data, which is usually kind of a prerequisite for mixed method studies. There are, I will acknowledge, some variations where you might have a single data set that you're analyzing qualitatively and quantitatively, say text data, for instance. But generally, we think about collecting more than one form. When I think of quantitative data, though, I think of more closed-ended data. So this is data that might be generated from things like surveys or instruments where you might have Likert type items or a scale, a semantic differential scale, something where there are fixed points that you're rating. So 5 points of agreement to disagreement, or rating on one end of a spectrum to another end of a spectrum. And that generates more of a numeric response. Things like tests, and this, very broadly could mean psychological tests, behavioral tests, educational tests, and on and on. Quantitative data could be in the form of observational checklists. So in an observational checklist, you might be in a setting and you're recording instances of behavior, and those counts, those numbers are what's important. So you may be going to a clinic, for instance, and observing what happens, how many people come and go, how often is there an interchange between a patient and a staff member, how long does it take for individuals. Those would be more quantitative observations. Or in a classroom, recording instances of behavior, for instance. Or another quantitative data source could be gleaning numbers from reports. So you're really focused on it could be financial numbers or accounting numbers, really regardless of what your field is. gathering those numerical values. Qualitative data I think of as more open-ended data. So you might be collecting through open-ended interviews, say semi-structured interviews where you use a series of open-ended questions. So, what was it like when you first went back to school? Or what was it like when you first learned you had this diagnosis? Just to give you a couple of examples. Could be open-ended observation. So to contrast that with some of the examples I just shared, maybe you're going to a setting, say it's a clinic or school, and instead you're taking detailed field notes. So you're writing text about what you see, what you observe happening, what's going on. You're not counting, but you're recording what it is you see. Documents, there are numerous examples here, but it could be things like policy documents or procedures or curricular documents. It could involve things like participant journals or diaries. All of those are potential documents that you could include. Social media data is another popular data source. And then audiovisual material, things like photographs and videos. So the next characteristic of mixed methods then is the use of rigorous qualitative and quantitative methods. And what we generally worry about here is that the two forms of research cannot sort of stand alone in terms of rigor. A lot of methodological reviews have looked at the quality of mixed method studies, and often the concerns are levied on the qualitative component of the study, that it's not strong enough or it's not rigorous enough. So this has sometimes been termed qualitative tokenism, where you have a largely quantitative study that's being conducted, and then you're maybe adding in a very minor qualitative piece, like an open-ended question. And not that there's any problem with having an open-ended question in a survey, but it single open-ended question doesn't produce the sort of rigor and rich responses as you might have with other methods. So I think part of maintaining the rigor of both the qualitative and quantitative methods is really understanding, but also being respectful of the intent of what both form of research brings. So qualitatively, we might be focused on understanding the meaning of an experience, of a phenomenon, for instance, or learning participants' views in their own words, just to give a few examples. Quantitatively, we often have very different intents where we might be testing a theory or testing a hypothesis, gathering evidence to support or refute it. Or perhaps we're measuring a phenomenon or looking at trends on a larger scale. So they do have very different intents. And in a mixed method study, that means really respecting both of those and ensuring that you have good quality in both your quantitative and qualitative components. So the other characteristic is the use of a mixed methods design. We'll delve into designs a little bit later, but we'll distinguish between these kind of core designs, three major designs that comprise a mixed method study, versus more complex designs where you could do something more with mixed methods research. But then what's really critical, and we'll spend most of our time on, is the integration of the two forms of research. So this is the key and defining feature of mixed methods that really distinguishes mixed methods from all other approaches. So if we have a study with a quantitative component and a qualitative component, but they're not actually integrated, I would probably call that a multi-method study, but not really a mixed method study. Integration, however, is this intentional combination of qualitative and quantitative research so that they really become interdependent with one another. They're really connected to one another. And integration is leading to new insights or new phases of research, which we'll talk about a little bit further as well. And then this final characteristic of mixed methods is that we're often using philosophy or theory as a lens for what we do. So philosophy or theory can guide your data collection and analysis. So maybe you're using a social learning theory or health belief model. There's numerous theories, too many to list. But the idea is that they're guiding both the quantitative and qualitative data collection. They're helping you to think about collecting data along similar concepts, and that can really guide the integrative analysis that you would do later on. Philosophical worldviews can also be an important part of mixed methods. So things like community-based participatory research or community-engaged research, where you're really doing research with a community as opposed to on a community and involving community members in all aspects of the research. But let's really focus on integration as this key feature of mixed methods research. So integration is really mixing. This is like mixing paints, for instance, where you mix yellow and blue, or in this case, I think it was red and blue, and it creates something new. It creates purple. And that's really the key feature of mixed methods, this mixing. So the idea is that we're intentionally collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, or using both methods, really leveraging the strength of what either one brings. And ultimately, integration is generating something new. And that's kind of how I think about it at a basic level. So that could mean that we're using one form of research in a systematic way to generate qualitative follow-up studies, to plan those qualitative follow-up studies, to understand quantitative results in more detail. Or something new could be instruments. So an example here is we start qualitatively and we're using those results in a very systematic way to develop or adapt a measure, a quantitative measure. Or it could be meta inferences. And meta inferences are a term that are used often in mixed methods research to refer to the results of an integrative analysis. And those have been termed as new insights. Some people prefer to call it new claims, but I think of it as something new that you're learning from integrating the two forms of research that's beyond what you would learn if you just looked at the two separately. And we'll delve into that in a little bit more detail as well. So what I want to focus on in the majority of our talk here is really centering integration in a mixed method study and centering it across multiple levels of a research design. And we'll walk through each of these. So at the level of your research questions, at your design, we'll talk about these mixed methods designs, how integration can occur at the level of methods. So methods are the procedures of our research, things like data collection, sampling, analysis. At the level of our results, so bringing together quantitative and qualitative results. And then finally, in interpretation and reporting, how you're actually disseminating and displaying your integrative results. So starting with integration at the research question level, for one, I think this is writing an aim or objective or purpose statement or research question that really reflects the need for integration. So the idea is to think about not only why do I need to do mixed methods research, which we'll talk about in a moment, but what do you hope to learn from mixing, from that integration? So, for example, maybe the need for integration is related to a research question where you need to know what explains a deviation from policy or guidelines. What explains what is happening? Or how does implementation, so more process, explain outcomes, more quantitative outcomes? Another example from healthcare, how do patient experiences, so what they actually experience gathered qualitatively, how does that relate to outcomes? This can expand to really any kind of intervention, an educational intervention, a healthcare intervention, interventions in business or management, for instance. So let's talk about these in just a little bit more detail, starting with this idea of integration through your rationale, your why of doing mixed methods research. And I think, that's kind of a important early starting point for a mixed method study, because just to be clear, mixed methods is more complex. It often does take a little bit more work than doing more of a mono method study. So thinking about what you really need to learn and hope to learn from integration ahead of time. So here are a few examples. Maybe you need to understand both trends and then also personal perspectives of individuals. So amplifying the voice of people. Or you need to explain relationships among variables or mechanisms that are actually occurring. Maybe you need to both generate and test theories. Maybe you need to create a new measurement or instrument or adapt one if one needs to be adapted. Maybe you need to explain quantitative outcomes in an experiment with a qualitative component, or to advance social justice perspectives or equity based on multiple perspectives. Maybe you need to evaluate both process and outcomes, so kind of the how and the how much of a program or a project, or create case profiles, for instance. So we also think about the research questions that provide guidance for where our starting point is for a mixed method study. And these could be research questions or aims or objectives, of course, depending on your field and whatever term makes most sense. But I'd like to distinguish this by thinking about what you hope to learn, and then what are some terms or words that actually appear in these research questions or aims. So in a mixed method study, we often think about writing qualitative research questions, quantitative research questions, and mixed methods research questions. And I think that's a nice framework, maybe for people who are newer to mixed methods in particular. So the idea is that you need to think about what you want to learn from your qualitative and quantitative and qualitative components, so you can think about what you hope to learn by integrating the two. So what you hope to learn qualitatively, it could mean individual experiences or meaning of something. It could mean individual perceptions. Quantitative research questions are often concerned with learning about probable cause and effect, or the relationship or correlation among variables, or maybe it's a comparison among groups. So maybe it's individuals who participated in intervention versus those who didn't, or you have existing groups that you want to compare, people who fit one group, fall into one demographic profile versus another, and you're comparing among groups. So then from a mixed methods research question, it's really a combination of experiences and then those relationships of variables or comparison among groups. And within each of these, then we have different keywords or terms that we look for. So qualitatively, often our questions are focused on meaning of experiences, or you see that word experiences, or they're focused on exploration or learning individual views. Quantitatively, we see terms like factors, maybe cause, and all kinds of variations of that, like influence and impact, and so on. We might see words about measures or determinants or correlations, trends, and so on. Mixed methods research questions then have a combination of those terms, but then also mixed methods terms like integration or explanation of variation, for instance. But I always really, think about starting with a research question, what you hope to learn, and that ultimately, in my opinion, guides what comes next. And that's thinking about what type of mixed methods design is the best fit for what I intend to do. And this process is not always entirely linear. Sometimes it is back and forth or iterative, of course. But I'm presenting it in a linear fashion just to sort of build for our purposes here today. So again, this is following the work of Cresswell and Plano-Clark, where they really define these three core designs: convergent, explanatory sequential, exploratory sequential, that form the building blocks of a mixed method study. But then we can do something more complex. We can intersect those with other ideas, like or other methodologies or other approaches, like evaluation or randomized control trials, for instance. So let's start, though, by talking about these core mixed methods designs. So a design is something that's meant to guide the entire process of research. And these designs are a starting point. They're not actually meant to stifle creativity in the research process, but it's meant to give you a starting point, thinking about where quantitative and qualitative come together, or where they occur, and then where they come together and will be integrated, often in multiple ways of a mixed method study. So the idea is to use these and then think about which of these designs might fit for what you want to do, and then what adaptations or changes are perhaps needed. So I'm going to start with a convergent design. You'll see this little diagram on the right-hand side. So in this diagram, when you see a rectangle, that's meant to indicate a solely qualitative or quantitative component. This oval is indicating more of an integrative or mixed methods component of it. So a convergent design, I think, is what most people new to mixed methods think of in terms of a mixed method study. And it's often thought of as more of a single phase of research where you have qualitative data collection analysis, you have quantitative data collection analysis, and you're going to integrate. You're going to bring typically the results together for the intent of making a comparison or looking at patterns among the qualitative and quantitative results in order to gain a more complete and comprehensive understanding. So it's that bringing together, that's where integration, one point where integration is happening in this type of design. So some applications or reasons for doing this, you need to look at quantitative trends or large numbers. You need to be able to generalize, but you want to also have more of those details and nuances and in-depth explanation. And you really are exploration. You need that for a more complete understanding. Maybe you need to validate or explain quantitative findings with qualitative data that you're collecting around the same time point. So you want to really kind of validate, do they agree? I've administered this measure looking at learning and motivation, but then I'm also talking to students and I want to see if the results compare, if I'm getting similar results between the two forms of research. Or you just simply want to expand your understanding. And it's often you need to expand your understanding of the qualitative data by bringing in the open-ended responses and nuances. So an example here would be maybe a survey that has both quantitative and qualitative open-ended items on it. So a second core design is an explanatory sequential design. And this is the first of two designs that happen in sequence. An explanatory sequential design begins with a quantitative phase. So if we look at this little figure on the bottom, and it's a quantitative phase where data are collected and analyzed, and then those results are used to inform a follow-up qualitative phase. So we see this oval here connecting to explain. And that qualitative phase is for the intent of explaining or unpacking, further understanding those initial quantitative results. So you're using that qualitative phase to explain, hence the name of this type of design. So some applications, you want to explain quantitative results with a qualitative phase you're collecting next. So maybe you want to explain variation in scores. What distinguishes people who did really well in this curriculum versus people who did not do so well? Or what explains the difference among individuals who have their blood pressure under control versus those who do not? Or what explains the difference in an organization with high productivity versus lower productivity, for instance, and you're using the qualitative to make that explanation or to give insight to that explanation. Or maybe you're using this design because you need to first start quantitatively to identify participants who've experienced a phenomenon that you want to then study more in depth qualitatively. So then to contrast that is an exploratory sequential design. So this is also at least too often a three-phase project, but it starts with a qualitative component. So the idea is you first need to explore qualitatively, and then it builds into some kind of a quantitative phase. A classic example here is that you would start qualitatively, use those results in a systematic way to develop an instrument or a measure, or maybe to adapt an instrument or measure, and then you're going to test that quantitatively. And then, of course, there's this final integration component at the end here where you might be looking across all of your results. So it might be assessing, did my initial qualitative findings, did they generalize when tested quantitatively? Or looking across all of it, let's say you started with a grounded theory model, and then you developed an instrument and tested that, looking across everything and thinking about what needs to change about your model, or how might you revise that initial model. We can also think about using those core designs and intersecting it with another design or another approach. So and these are more complex mixed methods designs, according to the Cresswell and Plano-Clark terminology. So you might be using mixed methods with grounded theory research or with case study research or with another approach like implementation science or interventions or trials. You could use mixed methods with program evaluation. So think about a combination of doing a needs assessment and identifying variables or measures, and then assessing program outcomes, maybe also assessing program process, and then maybe explaining those results. So often there's a series of quantitative, qualitative, and sometimes mixed methods phases with a program evaluation. You could also think about community engaged or community based participatory research or action research that can be used with mixed methods as well. And again, that would be more of a complex mixed methods design. So that's a little bit on integration at the design level. And the design level, again, is looking at the overarching process of research, thinking about when you have qualitative and quantitative pieces, where and at what often multiple time points are you integrating across those, but it's giving a picture of your overall process of research, keeping integration at the center of that. So another level to think about integration is at the methods level of a mixed method study. And I'll talk about four approaches or four strategies for integration at the methods level. First, considering your sampling and both the timing and the relationships of your sample, your qualitative and your quantitative sample. Next, matching data sources. And I think of this as sort of a pre-integration step to prepare you for integrative analysis. So matching, ensuring that there are at least some common concepts that you have qualitative and quantitative data collected on in order to prepare for that integrative analysis. Connecting, so using one form of research to inform the sampling of the other, or building, so using one form of research to inform the data collection of the other. So we'll talk about each of these four types of integration at the methods level, starting with the idea of timing. And I'm sharing this just to point out there are different possibilities for a mixed method study. And this is, a time to really think maybe about some of those possibilities for your work or your potential work. So for one, you could have a study done at kind of a single time point where you're sampling your qualitative and your quantitative sample at a single time point. And that's okay. That would be one way to approach mixed methods. Something that might be done in a convergent design. We're going to sample individuals, and then we're going to proceed with data collection among those individuals. We could also think about more of sequential timing. So this first example you see right here on top might be more of an explanatory sequential design, where at your first time point, you're identifying a quantitative sample, and then you might be using those results systematically, using purposive sampling methods to sample a qualitative sample at a second time point, or vice versa, that you see in this bottom example here. So this might be more of an exploratory sequential design. So the other aspect of this is the relationship between the qualitative and quantitative sample. And there are other possibilities as well, but I just want to talk through 5 different possibilities of these relationships in a mixed method study. So for one, you could have identical qualitative and quantitative samples. So the idea is that you might sample individuals, and we're going to survey all of them, and we're going to do interviews with all of them. And that's okay. That's maybe kind of an ideal, because you would have both forms of data on everyone that you could then integrate. But often it's just not realistic, especially thinking about larger sample sizes and just simple resources and time that it might take. So 2 options would be more of a nested, or you could think of kind of an enlarged sample. So in the nested sample that you see first here, you might have a larger quantitative sample, and then we're going to draw purposively a qualitative subset from that larger quantitative sample. And this can be done in a convergent design. It could be done in also an explanatory sequential design. And of course, there's some limitations that come along with that, because you won't have qualitative and quantitative data on everyone. But often it's just practically what's needed. And you should be transparent about those limitations and how you're kind of guarding against those through that purpose of selection. An enlarged sample is just kind of the reverse. So you might, for example, start with a smaller qualitative sample, and then we're going to collect a larger quantitative sample to try to generalize or try to test those results with a larger sample. You could have entirely separate samples. So uh, often from the same population, but we're going to draw our quantitative and qualitative sample separately. So they're not related. One is not a subset of the other. And then finally, and even more arguably complex mixed method studies, you might have sampling at multiple levels. And this happens in a lot of the work that I do, where we might have sampling that's done at, say, the level of a hospital. But then within the hospital, we're selecting staff to include in qualitative interviews and different types of staff that we might be including. We might have quantitative data at the level of a hospital or even something like a school or a school system or an organization. But then our qualitative are coming from individuals within those. So it can be more hierarchical levels as well. And that's really what's needed in some cases to address research questions. So also at the methods level is integration through the idea of matching. So in terms of matching, what I'm saying here is planning your qualitative and qualitative data collection to ensure that you're exploring at least some of the same concepts. So it's matching up your data sources. And I'll show you an example of that. This was a study done by Ellen Mosholm a few years back, and she was looking at quality of life as people underwent potential cancer diagnosis. So this is what I would call a joint display that's showing the matching of across domains of quantitative survey items with qualitative interview questions. So again, it's thinking about those common concepts that you're collecting. So on the left-hand side here are items from a European 30-item quality of life measure. So it's organized in domains. So she has this domain of emotional functioning, and then the questions, social functioning, and then the questions, and so on. And then what she did here is really matched in a systematic way what qualitative interview questions did she want to ask in order to understand those same concepts or explore those same concepts. So note that the match doesn't have to be one-to-one. For this series of questions on emotional functioning, the qualitative question, interview question was, would you describe how you emotionally were affected during the diagnostic process? But this is a really systematic way of planning for integration through what you might call matching. So another way to think of integration is integration through connecting. So here you're using the results of one form of data to inform sampling for the other. So for example, you might be interviewing participants based on a quantitative item. Maybe it's individuals who were outliers in the quantitative measure, and that's who you want to interview. Or maybe it's based on specific characteristics identified in the survey, and that's who you want to sample for interviews or focus groups or whatever the case is. But it's a systematic process, and this is called integration through connecting. Integration through building then is when one database is informing the data collection of the other. And I'll show two different examples of how that could occur. First, building from quantitative results to qualitative interview questions. So on the left-hand side of this figure here, I have quantitative results, and it could be on, say, major constructs, it could be key findings, it could be hypotheses that were tested. But the idea is to be really systematic in terms of planning those qualitative interview questions so that you really are explaining what you want to explain. And that's the idea behind this type of building integration. We could also think about the reverse, and this is something that you might use if you're developing an instrument or developing a measure, where you have qualitative results and you might be using your themes to identify what are my major scales or major sections on a survey or questionnaire. You're using your codes to identify what variables you're going to be measuring. And then you're using quotes to help with item writing so that you're using the language of participants and not your language as researchers to ensure that the items are better understood by the participants who might be completing it, for instance. So moving on now to integration at the methods level. And I'll talk about a couple of different types of merging integration, comparing results and relating results to examine patterns. But integration at the results level is what leads to those meta inferences. So understanding the benefit to the intervention and the experiences of participants, or outcomes in process, or what explains variation, for instance. Merging, though, is really the hallmark of a high quality mixed method study. But of course, you can only plan so well, and ultimately you won't know how the qualitative and quantitative compare until you have collected and analyzed your data. So I'm going to talk about two ways that I think of merging. One is merging through comparison. And the idea here is that you're bringing your qualitative and quantitative results together iteratively, going back and forth between the two. So from stories to numbers and themes and back to your scales in order to develop those meta inferences. And along the way, you're probably thinking about, do the quantitative and qualitative results confirm one another or contradict or expand your understanding? We could also think about merging through relating, so looking at themes by statistics and vice versa. And this is kind of like a cross tabulation. And we'll look at an example of this type of cross tabulation in just a few moments as well. But ultimately, through this merging type of integrative analysis, you're learning something new. So keeping in mind here, your goal is to create a compelling narrative, and the onus is on the researcher to report those integrative results. So part of that means creating those meta inferences. So these are the new inferences that really arise from your integrative analysis into a coherent whole. And I think without creating those meta inferences, that new insight, you're really not taking advantage of the full value of mixed methods research. Is kind of a cautionary tale. Keep in mind that through a comparison, there are potential outcomes that could emerge. You could have two results, say you're looking at a certain domain, the two results confirm one another, or they're kind of expanding your understanding. So you're getting maybe more nuances and details by integrating the qualitative. Or it could mean that they give a different understanding, like different perspectives, or the results conflict with one another. And often it's a combination of those. So if you compare on multiple domains, you might have some domains where there is clearly an agreement, and then you might have other domains where there's a disagreement. And that's a pretty common result of a mixed method study. So finally here, is how you actually represent your integrative results in a mixed method study. And traditionally that was done through narratives, so through prose. So in a results section, there might be of a paper or a thesis or dissertation, there might be a section on integrative results, and you would be noting, this was statistically significant, and here were related themes, and then this was the meta inference. Joint displays are more of a visual tool to develop those meta inferences. And software in particular, in my opinion, can be really helpful to generate those meta inferences. So I'm going to share two different types of joint displays. We'll look at examples in just a moment, what I call a side-by-side joint display, and then a themes by statistics joint display. But first, let's just look at an example of one of these joint displays. So this is from a study, and it was a study looking at how research teams develop these really complex studies called adaptive clinical trials. So this was research about research. I just want to be clear. This is kind of a meta study. And adaptive clinical trials use a lot of Bayesian methods, for instance. But the problem is that they can be really, really kind of complicated, so complicated that it can be hard for teams to get to work together. When applying for funding, it can be very difficult for reviewers to understand what's proposed. But the benefits of an adaptive clinical trial is that it can reduce a lot of potential waste. Let's say you're comparing three different interventions using these Bayesian simulations. I'm simplifying a bit, but you might get an early indication that one of those interventions or arms is not performing well. So you could reallocate participants to the others. So you're not wasting time on something that just doesn't seem effective. So, but back to the tool here, this is a joint display showing this combination of qualitative and quantitative results. So on the left-hand side here is a box plot. And this is from a survey question of attitudes about adaptive clinical trials. And the specific question was whether it poses ethical advantages from the patient's perspective. Each of these four different plots here, or we'll just call it a bar that you see, represents a different type of participant. So the green is connected to consultant biostatisticians. This tan color is clinicians. The purple is other stakeholders. So it could be advocates or regulators. And then this blue are academic biostatisticians. So the consultants were the Bayesian experts, and then the academic were kind of your traditional statisticians. So in this middle column here, which I've already kind of touched on, these are, in this case, the qualitative data. And it's organized by type of participant, and there are some quotes that appear here, also some summaries. These came from both interviews and then also open-ended questions. And then this final column is the meta inferences. So what more was learned by integrating these two forms of results than having kept them separately? And I won't, read through all of this to you, but I'm just going to kind of jump down in the middle here. In light of the polarized attitudinal scores and means, reconsideration of the qualitative data revealed a detailed and nuanced argument by the consulting biostatisticians compared to more generally supportive language by the others. And then it goes into a little bit more detail. So that's really trying to get at what was the new insight that was generated from this integration. So let me show you a couple of examples of different joint displays. And then we'll touch on how software can be helpful as well. So for one, a joint display can be a tool for merging through comparing. So you're using a table or a figure to visually compare qualitative and quantitative results on common domains in order to generate those meta inferences, that new insight. So here's an example of a side-by-side joint display from one of my studies. We were looking at basically physicians' perspectives and their views on virtual care. So telehealth is another way to think about that. So on the left-hand side here, we have quantitative results from one of the survey scales. And this was asking individuals to think about, reflect on these different types of groups of patients and if communication is adversely affected in telehealth versus an in-person visit. So on the left-hand side here, I'll just kind of jump to the bottom. Patients with disabilities, cognitive disabilities, older adults, and non-native speakers. So these rated among the highest quantitatively in terms of those groups being adversely affected by telehealth. So the middle column here then is the qualitative results, just focusing on those groups. And these are qualitative results of interviews with physicians. So for patients with limited English proficiency, so our kind of our findings or takeaways here, there were numerous barriers, including access to portals, so their patient version of the electronic health record, follow-up to visits, and then also the need for interpreters. So then the mixed methods meta inference, comparing across all of those, physicians generally noted more frequent adverse communication with non-native speakers, and the qualitative results clarified the specific barriers to technology, or the specific barriers that the technology presents. So this is, again, a visual way of not only conducting that integrative analysis, but reporting it. And, this joint display, like the other one we just looked at, actually went through multiple iterations. And we would argue that preparing this joint display is actually conducting integrative analysis as you're going through those multiple versions. So some steps in developing this type of joint display: analyze your qualitative and quantitative results separately, and then create a matrix linking your related qualitative and quantitative results, making that comparison, and then interpreting and developing meta inferences. And when you have a joint display, that can give you a structure for writing about integrative results. And here's just a really basic exercise for linking common themes and constructs. Just write out what are your qualitative sources and your themes. What are your, on that outer right-hand side, what are your quantitative sources and your major constructs or variables or concepts? And then draw lines connecting. And where you see a point of integration, that's saying that this is maybe a good candidate for integrative analysis. I could compare on these domains because there's commonality here. So in these slides, and I'm very happy to make these slides available, I also have some templates for joint displays. So here's a template for a side-by-side joint display. It can be organized in either way, but I have qualitative column first, organized by themes, then a quantitative column, and then the mixed methods interpretation. And this could address a research question such as, how do the thematic results and survey results compare? But the analytical process, or the intellectual process, is kind of like this. You're looking at a common domain or a theme and looking at, for that common domain, what are your qualitative results? What are your quantitative results? And then using that to think about what are meta inferences that could result from that. So finally, another type of integration is through more relating. So I think of this as looking at patterns of themes by statistics and vice versa. So it's another type of merging, in my opinion. But let's look at an example of a joint display. This is also from a study of mine. We were analyzing an intervention, and it was using virtual human technology to provide training on empathic communication. So it's sort of health sciences, also sort of education, also kind of computer science because of the virtual human gaming aspect, and then also communication. So it's really drawing from a number of different disciplines. But we looked at just the intervention group for this particular analysis. This is one of, among other analyses, and ultimately found that for the primary outcome measure, there were low performers, middle performers, and then high performers. And that was just kind of looking at a distribution of scores, if you will. So we looked at these quantitative results by themes that you see right here. And then in the cells of this joint display are some illustrative quotes. Now, alternatively, in the cells, it could be more of a summary of what was learned. And I'm not going to read through, all of this to you, but I just want to point out a couple of things that was really insightful to generate meta inferences. So for this first theme, and this is kind of an abbreviation, but it was about useful communication skills. So the extent to which they thought it was helpful to learn about communication. For low performers, there were actually no related comments. But for our middle and high performers, they said things like, I thought that I was given helpful strategies for interacting with patients, such as asking open-ended questions, validating feelings, and then types of nonverbal cues to use. So that's kind of helpful. I mean, that's is saying that for the low performers, they didn't really think that communication skills were useful. That's suggesting to us that this is a group that's missed by this intervention, and maybe it's important to do some work ahead of time so they understand the value of communication skills, Or maybe it's saying that this intervention is just not going to be effective for some of those types of learners in this case. But that's the type, it's fairly obvious, but it's a type of insight we would not have learned without this integrative analysis. So here is a template for a themes by statistics joint display. So you have themes as rows, and then the columns represent quantitatively different groups. And then you might have both a final column and a final row for meta inferences. So the analysis process could look like this. You have a theme and you're looking across high, middle, and low scores. And this certainly doesn't have to be an intervention. This could be, applied to any type of research, and using that to generate meta inferences. Alternatively, you could be looking sort of down across these groups. So for high scores, what were their themes? So kind of developing a profile, if you will, as a meta inference for high scores compared to middle, compared to low scores. And then in your final little box here, it could be sort of a meta inference across all of these results. Is there a major pattern that you can extract? In order to develop this joint display and to conduct this analysis, we use the segment matrix in Maxqda. And this is just an excerpt of the segment matrix. So what's really valuable is that you can import document variables, and that's what we did, to all of our qualitative data. So we had qualitative data for every individual in this study, but I could bring in their quantitative scores. We also had some pretest measures, demographics. And then at that point, it unlocks the ability to use things like crosstabs in the segment matrix. And in the segment matrix, what you can do is focus on a qualitative code at a time. So I just clicked on a code right here, and I've asked for a column for my low, my middle, and my high performers. So here I can look at the actual segments of text for that particular code and make those comparisons and think about, well, is this code explaining variation or differentiating the high versus low performers? And then I can move on to the next code. So it's a really systematic way to step through your data and conduct that integrative analysis. And this is a tool that I use extensively in mixed method studies. Again, it's what I use, and this is an excerpt of data from that joint display, the published joint display that we just looked at. But I find this a really, really helpful way to do that systematic integrative analysis in mixed methods research. So I know we're at time. I'm probably just a little bit past time, but I'm going to hand it back over here for some words on Maxqda, and then we'll have time for question and answer.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you very much for this great presentation, and especially for the wonderful templates. I can see a lot of people thanking for that in the chat, and I think that is something that is very valuable for all of us. And on that point, I would also like to add and tell you more about Maxqda, which is a software for qualitative and mixed methods research. And I think that that is also very interesting when it comes to creating join displays and also populating them. I am sharing my screen with you, and I have a short presentation where I prepared a couple of slides on showing you what Maxqda can do and how it can support a mixed methods research study. So first of all, what you can do is let me just show you. I would like to show you how a Maxqda interface looks like. And so Maxqda is a standard software with a local installation where you can work in work in projects. So when you are starting your research project, you would create a project file and you would populate that with all of your data. And what Maxqda allows you to do is to have a quick view of your entire project with all of your project data at one place. So if you have different data types, if you have different type of data collection that you have done, you can collect them all at one place, and they would show up here right in your project. interface of Maxqda is divided into 4 windows. The first window here would be where you can see and structure your data. The second window would be where you can read and edit your data that we call documents in Maxqda. So here I have an example of an interview that you could see, and here in the second window you could read, you could edit, you could browse through that. The third window is what it is very helpful when it comes to especially the qualitative part of your project. This is where you can see your codes, your category system that you can build in Maxqda. And the fourth window is where you can see this we call the retrieve segments window, and this is where you can see the results of your coding, which also helps you to find coded segments. And when it comes to mixed methods analysis, that might be interesting, that it also allows you to display your variables so that you can immediately contextualize this qualitative data in the context of your quantitative research as well. Coding qualitative data is very easy in Maxqda. You simply highlight a segment that you deem interesting, and then you can select the feature that you would like to create a new code. You can name this code. You can create a memo that can capture, for example, the code definition, and then you can also create a comment on the coded segment. And what happens then is that this information will be recorded right on your data. So the highlighted segment will turn colorful, and you will be able to see a coding stripe among with your comment as well. This is a process that you can do both manually, but also with the help of AI Assist, with the help of an AI model. You can also create codes via the feature AI coding. And I have seen in the chat that we had a question about how AI can assist you in your mixed methods research. So I think this is a point which we can get back later on in our discussion. Once you have created your codes, they would all show up in your code system. That was the third window what I just showed you, and this is where you can build a category system to organize your qualitative data. And here that also this window also allows you to see frequencies, so how often you have applied a particular code in your project. You would also be able to see your code memo that, for example, contains your code definition, but also your reflections or your notes as well. And of course, everything what you do in Maxqda is editable, so you could also export it out with the help of the reporting tools right in the software. Maxqda also allows you to work with variables and statistics. So you can use coding for your qualitative data, and you can use the variables for your quantitative data. You can work with variables for your documents, for your codes, and for your speakers as well. As I showed you, this is always linked. So when it comes to retrieving qualitative information, you will always be able to see your favorite variables linked directly next to that. You can also use this. You can use the variables to create statistics right in the software. So here, for example, I have just created a quick chart about to have an overview of my respondents. How many children do they have in this project? Maxqda can also help you to create various outputs of the relationships of your documents, codes, and variables. We have a crosstabs feature that allows you to see how um, how often you code how often your coded segments appear across different demographic groups. We also have a code relations browser that allows you to see the relationships of between your qualitative codes. you can also build models and maps with the help of Maps, which is a mind mapping tool. We also have code and document maps that allow you to do cluster analysis. You can also create a similarity analysis of your documents based on your coding. And Maxqda also comes with a um, a comprehensive statistical module that allows you to do statistical analysis with your document variables. This is just a short selection to give you an idea what you can do with your codes and variables. But of course, I am very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Just to also tell you a bit about us. So we are Verbi Software, a Berlin-based company, and we are the creators of Maxqda. Maxqda has been around for a long time, for more than 30 years now, and this is a family-led company, and we are all located here in the heart of Berlin. You can see a picture of our team right here. We provide a lot of events for a lively community. So webinars, lectures such as this, conferences and events. My colleagues will be posting some links in the chat where you can also meet us